Hello. So I want to do this third and final video for test prep, just to talk about some of the themes that'll show up on test two. We've already covered Islam and states and gold and the Atlantic slave trade. In this video, I want to kind of try to briefly get through colonialism and the push for independence, those things. So each of these are huge, huge issues indeed. Each of the four topics are pretty broad. With colonialism, there's a lot of different ways we can go, but particularly on the test, I'm focusing on a couple of things that I want you to look at. In our book by Collins, he talks a lot about the colonial attitude, the sort of justifications that European countries gave themselves for going into Africa, a region of the world that they didn't really have any connection with, and actually seizing territory and imposing governments. This is what we saw in parts 2 and 3 of Things Fall Apart, right? So hopefully you'll have some memories stirred. So those attitudes about Christianity, about commerce, about civilization, these are things to pay a little bit of attention to as he discusses this. This is also nicely covered, especially at the very beginning of the Basil Davidson video that's on the topic intro page. That's really excellent. And again, there's a video too, a shorter one, of Achebe talking a little bit about colonial rule. And so you get a good sense of the sort of attitudes of the colonial governments. Collins also talks about technology. And there he talks about things like steam power, the ability to basically make boats go without having to row or having to use sails. This was an advantage for European powers. Another thing that was necessary before Europeans could go in and travel through Africa was quinine. Quinine is what gives that bitter taste. If you've ever had a gin and tonic, tonic water has a really bitter taste to it. That is quinine. It was originally drunk by various kinds of people in the tropics to prevent malaria. It was the first effective medicine against malaria. And so that allowed Europeans to stay alive in parts of tropical West Africa, whereas before their life expectancy was maybe 2 or 4 years. During the slave trade, that was certainly the case. So technology and attitude, these are the things that you want to be thinking about as we're going into that and kind of review some of it, as well as some of the other questions. And hopefully, maybe you can make some connections with the novel Things Fall Apart, the DC, the two missionaries there, good examples of those attitudes. The massacre of Abame is an example of the weaponry that Europeans were able to bring to bear on African societies and allow them to defeat them and conquer them. All right, so that's the colonialism part. The independence part is really a complicated and something that we just deal with too briefly, but it's a really important part of Africa's history, that push for independence to overthrow colonial rule. Colonial rule only lasted in Africa about a lifetime, 60, 70, 80 years, depends on where we're talking about and so on, but it lasted just a brief time. So in some ways it changed a lot. In other ways it didn't change a lot of things either. This is something historians still debate about a lot. Couple of the things that Collins will focus on, and you should be ready to talk about in the test, are the effects of the two world wars. Those Africans who got pulled in and were forced to fight for the French or the British during these wars, the huge sacrifices that they made, had a deep impact on them. Also, if some Africans kind of bought into the idea of European superiority, something that Europeans were pushing to their colonial subjects in Africa as they're fighting alongside Europeans, in many cases shooting at other Europeans and being pretty successful in their war fighting, they begin to reassess themselves and their position in the world. And so Africans come out of these two world wars not only aggrieved for the kinds of sacrifices that they've been forced to make, but also aware of their own capabilities and skills and ability to challenge European power. Another huge thing is the Great Depression. Now, The Great Depression we think about in the United States, but it was a global depression, and this global depression hits Africa too. Africa was set up during the colonial period to kind of produce cheap cash crops, and with the depression, the demand for those cash crops dropped. And trying to boost that demand up, European countries often forced Africans to accept even lower prices for these crops. So there was a lot of unhappiness there. However, as you're writing for the exam, make sure we're talking about Africans and not the African American experience. There are certainly similarities between the African experience and the African American experience, but they're also fundamentally different, right? The history of the Great Depression in the United States is different than the history of the Great Depression in Africa. So please be aware of those distinctions. Two other things to look at in Collins that he talks a little bit about is how colonial rule kind of created the idea of tribe. That tribe really wasn't all that big of a deal in Africa beforehand. Yeah, there were all these different languages and stuff like that, but people didn't really identify themselves by tribe. Think of Things Fall Apart. They don't identify themselves as Igbos. They identify themselves as people of Umofia, the people of Mbanta, these various different clans, these different sections. What colonialism does is it groups Africans in accordance to this idea of tribe, and it became the only way in which Africans could engage in politics during the colonial period. And as a result, in some countries, politicians found their natural political base among these various ethnic groups. And what that led to is competition between these ethnic groups for political power. And we still see the difficulties of this in a number of African countries where ethnicity becomes an issue. Often not every day. You don't find people fighting on the basis of ethnicity on a daily basis. But when it comes time for national elections, when there's high stakes over who's going to win and who's going to lose, you can find that ethnicity, tribe, gets activated and it becomes a political issue. And lastly, Collins does a good job of talking about Africans, just ordinary Africans' deep impatience with the first generation of political leaders after independence. They had such high hopes after the oppression, after the basically being made to work for Europe for such a long time. The hope was that as soon as they got rid of Europe, things would get a lot better. And they did for a little bit, but then the economic realities kind of set in, and that impatience and that difficulty really kind of set up some of the real challenges for post-independent Africa. All right, cool. Well, that's that, and have a good test.